My name is Farzaneh, and I'm the lead volunteer for today's SPE Café. Today, we will discuss building a sustainable and inclusive food system in Canada. This cafe will be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube channel. We begin by acknowledging the lands on which we gather today. SPE is based in Dalhousie, also known as Montreal, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Ghanaian Guhage, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. We further acknowledge the deep ties between colonialism and modern Western science and research, especially in Dalhousie, where it's host to a large research ecosystem. We encourage our participants and everyone to challenge their own ties to systems of oppression that have marginalized Indigenous communities. I'd like to remind everyone that all attendees are muted to ensure our virtual cafe is considerate and respectful. However, we encourage you to turn on your cameras so we can have an audience of welcoming faces for our speakers. Please note that we will be offering simultaneous French interpretation during the event. You can use the interpretation button to set your preferred language. We will begin with a brainstorming activity, followed by introductions. Then our invited speaker, Dr. Alison Blay-Palmer, will discuss ways to improve the Canadian food system with our moderator, Dr. Monika Korzun, for approximately 20 minutes. Then we will have our Q&A session for around 15 minutes. You may submit questions at any time in the chat in English and French during the discussion, and we will try to answer as many as possible. Please indicate whether your question is for a specific speaker. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please send a direct chat message in the chat box to Kit and our SPE member, and we will try to help you. This talk will be followed by a small group discussions in English and French, about 20 minutes, where you will have the opportunity to exchange with other members of the audience on the Canadian food system. I'd like to start with a brief introduction to Science and Policy Exchange, or SPE. We are a nonprofit organization based in Montreal, run by volunteer graduate students and early career researchers who are passionate about furthering the dialogue between science, policy, and the public. Your hosts today are a team of SPE volunteers and myself. If you are interested in our upcoming events, or what else we are working on at SPE, please check out the links in the chat. This event was organized in partnership with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. You can find our contact info in the chat now. And before opening up tonight's discussion, we'd like to hear from you. Okay, great. So we can see the majority are coming from the academic and research sector, followed by students, again, academia, and then government. Perfect. Thank you for answering the first questions. Now I think we can move on with the second question. This one will be interesting because we want to give you an opportunity and give us an opportunity to hear about 1 to 3 barriers to sustainable and inclusive food system in Canada, please. I see more answers are coming. Food sovereignty, culturally relevant. Yeah, very important. Competing interesting of go. Lack of local food system. Collaboration, corporate agenda, cost of land. And inclusion, yeah, it's in the center. So I think we are ready to move on with our tonight's discussion. So let me start with introducing our speakers. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Alison Blay-Palmer, the UNESCO Chair on Food Biodiversity and Sustainability Studies. She is also the founding director of the Center for Sustainable Food Systems and a professor in Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. Please see the full bios and contact info of our guest speakers in the chat. And our invited moderator is Dr. Monika Korzun, a postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University, exploring the social aspects of sustainable agriculture in the agri-food industry. Monika has been working in the Canadian food system space in various capacities since 2010, including academia, nonprofit sector, and private sector. So welcome to both of you. Monika, the floor is yours to kick off the event.
Thank you so much, Farzaneh, for the introduction. And thank you so much to the entire Science and Policy Exchange team for organizing the event, but also for creating this space for us where we can talk about such an important and sometimes debated topic, which is the food system. So I'm honored and really excited to moderate this cafe today. Dr. Alison Blay-Palmer is our rock star in our field. So I'm excited to learn from her and engage in this discussion. So let's get started with the first question. Alison, what is a sustainable food system?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Monika. Before I answer, I'd just like to thank the team as well. It's been really interesting developing this World Cafe event together. And everybody's been really responsive, and that's much appreciated. And I think that that's important because, and I'm delighted to get to talk to you, Monika. You're doing such important work in the food system space in Canada as well. So it's great to get to have this chat. And I think, as was demonstrated by the question on what are the 1 to 3 words that you would use to describe the food system in Canada, I think that really reflects the complexity of the food system. And because it's complex, it offers us both many challenges, but also some opportunities. So to answer your question now, Monika, sorry, I am getting there. The first thing that I would say is there's an environmental dimension. So we want to have a food system that's green, that it's ecological, that it's regenerative, that it's halting biodiversity loss, and that it fulfills this idea of ecological food production, and also that it diminishes greenhouse gas emissions to the extent possible. And those are all really important things because the food system right now is responsible for about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, the industrial food system in the world. So it's really important that we move in a greener direction. And it's also responsible for about agriculture, as it's practiced on a large scale, is responsible for about 80% of biodiversity loss. So it's sort of that good side, bad side kind of thing. So where there's a challenge, there's also an opportunity. So that's how I see things. So in addition to the environmental dimension or the ecological considerations, there's also the dimension, the sociocultural dimension of fairness and equity. And this means including gender-sensitive considerations, that it's inclusive of BIPOC communities, that it's grounded in the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and that in terms of the economy and what that looks like, and also in terms of flows of materials and people and food, that it's localized and circular as much as possible. So those are sort of, if we think about the SDGs, those tick those boxes when we think about sustainability. And really, agroecology is a great model when we're thinking about what is sort of the gold standard for sustainable food systems, because agroecology is diverse. It practices regenerative growing systems that can happen within forests. It's very circular, and it's also takes care of the soil and the water and the seeds. But at the same time, it fosters communities. And that's really an important dimension of food as well, is that it offers us these opportunities to think about community in a really collaborative, lovely way. That if we're not thinking about food as, if we think about food as beyond nourishment, food can really help generate some wonderful community-based and collegial sorts of opportunities. The other thing that's important, in addition to these sustainability considerations, is the idea of policy. And in order for these food systems to succeed, they need to, like, to have a sustainable food system, you need to have a policy context at all the scales. So from the municipal up to the provincial or state level or county or whatever, up to the federal level, and then also be supported at the supranational scale. So like the SDGs, for example, support to a certain extent sustainable food systems. So we really need to have coherent or well articulated policy across scales as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I think what I appreciate, kind of stood out for me there was, looking at it through a food systems lens, it is more holistic, but at the same time more difficult as well. Yeah. But it requires us to integrate actions by various stakeholders, as you said, right? Different levels of government and from different sectors, right? Including not-for-profit industry and so on. And at the same time, when we're doing that, thinking about the future generations, making sure that that's also taken into consideration, right?
Absolutely.
So going off that then, how is food insecurity linked with the food systems lens?
Well, the food systems lens helps us to understand the nuances, as you were suggesting, the holistic nature of circumstances that contribute to food insecurity. So there's a bit of a myth that we need to be producing more food when in fact we have enough food in the world for everyone to eat a healthy diet. And unfortunately, despite that fact, 3 billion people, based on United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates, cannot afford a healthy diet. So what that tells us is there's a financial dimension, there's a link to poverty that's very much involved in the food security question that's really important. And this is something that we see in both the global north and the global south. So this is really a unifying issue around poverty for sustainable food systems. If we're thinking about food systems in different places, I'm always looking for common places for solidarity, I guess, where people can come together and work together as much as possible around the world. And definitely poverty is one of the places, unfortunately, where there is definitely opportunities for that. So I think what that points us to, if we're thinking about a systems perspective in dealing with and trying to think about how to have a more sustainable food system that feeds people and gives them access to healthy food, it points us to several solutions. And I can't get into all of them right now, but I'm sure hopefully people will raise some of their own ideas in the chat. But I mean, one of the things that's also part of our food system right now is we waste a lot of food. So between a third and so like about 30 to 50% of food, depending on how you look at the food system, gets wasted. And if you think about what that means in terms of producing all that food that then doesn't get consumed, that's a huge waste of resources and all kinds of things and it's an opportunity for doing food systems differently. And there's lots of people who are trying to crack that nut. And it also makes us think about closed loop food systems. So why is it important, for example, to have animals in food systems and what that means, as opposed to using synthetic or chemical-based or fossil fuel-based fertilizers to grow our food? So when we start to think about this link between the food system and food security, it lets us unpack things in a more comprehensive way, and that allows us to come up with solutions that are not just band-aids necessarily, but can actually help to move the needle towards sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think using that lens and linking to food security encourages us to think about the root causes, right? Like why does food security or insecurity exist in the first place? And as you mentioned, often it's phrased as a question of production. And I think by limiting to production as the solution really misses the opportunity for us to address other issues like food waste and looking at those really underlying causes food security. You brought up policies when we were talking a little bit earlier. So what are the role of policies in strengthening this food system? And what are the challenges and benefits of using policies?
Yeah, I think a lot of the challenges in Canada and beyond in terms of developing food policy is we don't have a Ministry of Food. They do in Brazil, or they did, and I think they'll have another one with the new government there now. But we don't have a Ministry of Food in Canada. We have a we have a Department of Agriculture. We have a Department of Health. We have a Department of the Environment and Climate Change. So we have very siloed policy levers at our disposal for food, which is unfortunate, because if we could come together, and this is what the Canadian food policy tries to do, but it's very challenged because of the underlying situation in Canada. I mean, just because we have a Canadian Food Policy Council doesn't mean that all the other challenges disappear, right? And these problems are replicated at the level of the provinces as well. I think where we start to see the opportunity for those boundaries to be broken down is through municipal food policy councils. So those institutions can work across different departments because they're a little bit more footloose, and they can be more flexible and see things more from a community-based point of view. And what's really important for policy, I think, is that as it's being developed, that it be grounded in the realities of communities, because that's how policy gets taken up, and that's how policy is empowering, and that's how policy is effective in the end. So policy consultations, or policies that are developed and they are holistic and that cross some of those silos and that are responsive to communities, can be really effective in addressing change or bringing about change.
Yeah, I think, again, we have policies at different levels, but as you mentioned, focusing on local or municipal or even community or neighborhood policies is very important, as those community organizations know best what their members want or need, right? And then they can pass that up to hires. Yeah.
Well, there's a principle in the governance literature that talks about subsidiarity, and the idea there is that there's that policy policy supports action at the lowest level that makes sense for making something happen. And this is actually a principle that's entrenched in the EU principles. We don't really have anything like that in Canada, but I think it's another way of recognizing that communities are really where things happen, exactly as you're saying, Monika, and that's where we can bring about really impressive change.
Any examples you can think of successful kind of community practices?
Yeah, I think that when we had COVID land on us, what COVID did was it really exposed strengths and weaknesses in our food system and made them really apparent in a way that wasn't apparent before, because people we were in our houses, or we were in the places where we live, and we were isolated. And so we were looking at the world maybe in a different way than we had before. And so I think that some of the things that happened in COVID were really fantastic. So, for example, there's an online sort of farmers market called Open Food Network. It's a shared space. It's open access code, and what it does is it connects farmers to through aggregation to eaters. So that really took off, and apps that did that really took off during COVID. And I think that was a great step forward within Canada. But to give you an example at the global scale, I worked with a community, or I worked with the city of Antananarivo in Madagascar. And before COVID hit, we were working with them and a number of other cities on developing preparedness strategies. And part of that was developing multi-actor groups to consider how action could be made, action could be taken in the food system. And they were identifying different strategies that would help them be more resilient to climate shocks and other hazards. And the other hazard appeared in the form of COVID. And what we discovered was that city was actually better prepared to deal with COVID than it otherwise would have been, because the trust was being built. People knew who to talk to. They knew how to respond because they were thinking about that. And in the end, there was a much better response. So they were able to put in place ways to save food that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to, because the system was more connected. They had more of a system than a bunch of people just working independently. So I think that's one of the that's a really good example of successful community practices, is having a community that works together across the policy realms and that is action oriented and that can prepare the food system to be resilient in the face of shocks and hazards.
Yeah, and I think that one of the kind of silver linings of COVID was, it was demonstrated the value of community organizations, right, of civil society, how they're able to pivot and work together, able to kind of demonstrate the needs of their community members, pass it on, share information, exchange resources. It just kind of showed like the real importance and value of community organizations in our society. And many, I think, many organizations unfortunately had to pivot, had to also participate in emergency food provision and had to step away from policy making. But
absolutely.
A lot of them were still able to do both, overworked and under-resourced.
And real heroes. The people who stepped up and were able to do that work are really amazing people. And but as you're saying, I think what it did was it exposed some of the rifts. Like, it made things more obvious so that we could see where the challenges were. And I think that allowed us to think about things like basic guaranteed income, and how that would be could be part of the solution in terms of addressing poverty issues and access to food. And it really made, because BIPOC communities in the pandemic in Canada were disproportionately impacted. And it really made us step back and look at our food system quite differently to how we had been looking at it before. It really magnified and amplified the problems and the solutions. And you're absolutely right, Monika. A lot of the community organizations were really key to addressing a pandemic issue. And I think there are some great groups in Quebec that offer exemplary solutions. So there's a farm, for example, it's called The Farm in Compton, and they have 400 acres of organic production. And it's a really great example because they're producing milk for cheese that's sold in local stores. They have asparagus, and all of their production is organic. And one of my favorite examples in Montreal is Saint-Tropez-Roulant, that's been around since 1995. I don't know if people are aware of this or not, but it's a relatively small not-for-profit that does Meals on Wheels, and they actually deliver food that's prepared by the volunteers at Saint-Tropez-Roulant in their kitchen. And they provide food to the elderly. It involves intergenerational knowledge a little bit, I guess, but also contact, which is really important. So it helps to address mental health issues. And they were really important. Organizations like that, as you were saying, were really important during the pandemic. So, and they produce as much food as they can in their own gardens. They offer gardening workshops so people can learn and practice organic food growing. So this helps to address food insecurity issues as well. And I mean, we're really lucky because there's a lot of organizations that are doing that kind of work. But I think it's important to, and I know I'm watching the time, and I know we have to turn our attention to the questions like 2 minutes ago, but sorry for that. But I think it's also really important to think about the idea that these not-for-profit organizations are really letting government off the hook and stepping in where the people who we elect to represent us and govern our country and our cities and everything for us, they're responsible for providing those what should be public services. And I think it's amazing that those organizations exist, but they shouldn't have to. So I think there's for me, there's a lot of tension there. But I mean, if you talk to people in the food bank organizations, the common thing that they've said for years and years is, we know we will have been successful when we don't have food banks anymore. And yet most food banks own the building that they operate out of, because that's the most cost-effective way for them to deliver their services. So if you own the building, you're probably not going anywhere for a while, right? So there are all these tensions within our food system, and not just here. I mean, these tensions exist in many different places, but anyhow, so over to you. Sorry, Monika.
No. And again, these are topics that, each require hours and hours of discussions. I mean, there's so many books written about individual topics. There's no way we can cover all that. Maybe just quickly, what are the major kind of gaps in creating a more inclusive food system in Canada, and any solutions you can offer to doing that?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I think as we discussed, the gaps became pretty clear in COVID. I think we need to address the issue of poverty. We need to address the inequities across different communities. We need to think about the kind of food production system we have. It's very export oriented. And is that the kind of food system that we want to have? Because we push our farmers, we criticize our farmers, but because they're large scale farmers and they do everything using technology. But for me, we have pushed them in that direction through public policy for decades. So that's really on us. That's not on them. We're the people who have decided through our government that that's what we wanted to have. So, and then, making a healthier food system so people have access. I think the food guide that we have, the Canada Food Guide, is one of the best in the world, the most recent version. It's really about celebrating food. It doesn't prescribe very much. I think that's a good thing that we've done in Canada. But again, it's the voices that are missing in terms of BIPOC, gender sensitive food policies. And also the community voice is missing in a lot of cases. So that voice that we said is important. It's hard for those people to be heard, and it's hard for them to bring about change, especially as we go up the different levels of government where there's increasing influence of corporate interests. The higher we go up the government, I think the closer we are to the municipal level, the less influence there tends to be of the corporations. If you had to do pyramids or triangles, sorry.
Thank you, Alison, for sharing your knowledge with us. I guess we'll have 10 minutes for some questions, so I'll turn it over to Farzaneh to moderate the question session.
Yeah, thank you, Monika. Thank you both for the comprehensive and engaging conversation. I wanted to continue this engaging and fascinating conversation, something that is close to my heart as a food security researcher. So, but let's move on with the Q&A session. We know that Dr. Blay-Palmer, she cannot stay with us. I think she will leave in 10 minutes. So we would like to start the Q&A session. We have one question for Dr. Blay-Palmer, and the question is, that holistic view of food systems was illuminating. How might we foster more policy coherence across departments? For example, how might Canada's food guide be prompted while agriculture policy also align with the same goals of ensuring more have access to healthy foods?
So I think that I guess it would require a restructuring really of policy to apply a food lens that would allow us to think about things more from a food systems perspective. And an example that I can give you is in Baltimore. There is within the city, within the city, they have many different departments, the way lots of cities are organized that way. And when they decided they wanted to do some food systems reform, what they leaned into was they appointed someone into the mayor's office. So there's a direct link between what's going on with the mayor and this appointed person. But then what they also did was they put into the different departments, they put a person who had a food interest. So what that helped to do is that helped to bring a food lens to the conversations that were happening around, for example, parks and rec, or around providing, thinking about green spaces in the city, thinking about different regulations for different businesses. So by putting a person into the different departments across the city, they were really able to put that lens on to begin with, and that by virtue of doing that, conversations started to emerge around food as a system, as opposed to food as a way of feeding people and a caloric thing, or food as a way of creating, generating wealth as an economic development opportunity or whatever. And they started to cross those barriers, and food became more of a coherent conversation. And when you can do that, then you can start to solve more problems at the same time, and you get synergies, because as I said at the beginning, there are a lot of problems related to food. So if we can use food as a lever for change, then we're able to address many things at the same time, potentially.
Great, Alison. Thank you. That's a great reply.
I will add that I think we're increasingly seeing that across cities in Canada as well. For example, in Atlantic Canada, Charlottetown has at the municipal level also hired like a food systems person. So yeah, San Diego has had one, I think, for about 20 years as well. So yeah, it's gives us hope. Yep.
Absolutely. But it's also a cautionary tale, because we've lost our Food Policy Council pretty much in Toronto right now. And that's a really unfortunate circumstance, because that was really for decades held up as the shining example of Food Policy Council in the world. So yeah. Another thing that cities can do at the municipal level is there's something called the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact that focuses on 6 different thematic areas of sustainability, basically. And by going through the process of becoming a city that adopts the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, it can raise an awareness and help to generate conversations between different departments within cities. And I've seen that work really effectively to help focus things on food, and that really can bring about important changes in cities.
And I could add to the Milan Urban Food Pact too, is that it's very much integrating with other sectors, right? Like transportation, resource management. So it really uses food as a lens versus just kind of isolating as a separate issue. I think there's 5 cities in Canada have signed. I think Guelph might be the most recent one that's added to that list as well.
Yeah, it started off in 2015, and I think a couple of years ago, I haven't looked into it lately, but a couple of years ago, there were over 200 cities. So it's really becoming a force to be reckoned with. And another thing that's interesting about it as an approach is they hand out awards every year. And so they have amazing case study examples across a suite of different interventions that they can use as good examples of good practice. So that's also interesting.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the discussion. We have one more question. So I would love to hear an update about the Canadian Food Policy Council.
Yeah. Hi, Barb. Thanks for that question. Yeah, things are moving slowly. How's that? That's a really loaded question. Maybe you want to email me another time and we can discuss that offline. Yeah, it's it's going in fits and starts, I think, is the best way to put it. There's a lot of good intention, and a lot of difficulty in bringing things together in a holistic way. I think one of the most promising things that that's happening, sort of related to that in a way, is the school nutrition focus across the country. That seems to be gaining a lot of traction. So and seems very hopeful. So that's a good thing.
Great, thank you, Alison. I would like to wrap up our discussion with the general questions. Tonight we have people from different sectors. So I'd like to ask both of you, Monika and Alison, what is the role of each of these sectors in strengthening the food system? I would like to start with industry and then with government and nonprofit very quickly. I know it's broad, but just
Monika, do you want to get us started?
Where do we start?
I know.
I think the most important thing is for them to work together. Like, if I had to say one thing, we're often seeing, at least from my experience with working like in the not-for-profit sector mostly, and sometimes academia too, work is happening in silos, very much isolated. So we need everybody, including industry, to work together. That would be the one thing I could say in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, I agree with that. The other thing that I would suggest is, so working across silos for sure, working across sectors, but I also think that it's really important for us to recognize that there's a space for what I would call scale appropriate interventions through food processing or distribution. So I think that in order to have a more resilient food system, we could think about moving away from the corporate dominated food system that owns the seeds, that produces all the fossil fuel based chemicals, and that really drives our food system in an export oriented direction. And I'm not sure that that's the best thing for Canadians in the end. So I think it's really important to engage with the private sector, but I think it needs to be done with a level of awareness, and also by making space for regional or local companies to be part of the space as well.
Great, thank you. And we have one comment from Barbara. Despite many shocks and emergencies that we have experienced, building resilient food systems still doesn't seem to be on the agenda, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is definitely the case, and it's a challenge to know what to do with that. I have been doing work with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and there are people who are working on addressing that and figuring out ways that building resilience can be enabled. But as you know, it's very complicated getting all the needed players to the table to bring about that change. But I think one of the things that I find encouraging is, if I think back in some ways, if I think back 20 years, I think that we know a lot more now than we did then. And I think that that's hopeful. And the other thing that I think is hopeful is we've got a good sense of what the problems are. We also have a lot of tools that we can bring to the table to solve the problems, in terms of things like agroecology and open food network, for example, and how to connect those kinds of spaces together. And so I think really the big challenge now, as you were intimating, is that we need the policy people to come to the table and enable the change to happen.
Thank you so much. Monika, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think, Barb, there are seeds of hope. Looking at various community organizations, for example, the Toronto Black Food Sovereignty Plan was developed during the pandemic. There's many kind of food policy councils across the country that are doing amazing things, and getting cities to develop food charters, food strategies. So there are seeds of hope, and the movement is growing, definitely.
Great, thank you so much. I think we've reached the end of our Q&A session. And thank you so much to our excellent speakers. Dr. Blay-Palmer leaves us after this session, but Dr. Korzun will stay with us for the second part of the cafe and breakout room discussions. Dr. Blay-Palmer, on behalf of our entire team at SPE, we sincerely appreciate your invaluable contribution to our cafe tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been really great to be part of your event, and I'm really glad that you invited me. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I wish you a good rest of your event. Enjoy.
Thank you. And for everyone who wants to follow up with Dr. Blay-Palmer, you can find her contact info in the chat.
And also just thanks, Monika. It was really great to have this time with you. So be well,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us.
Oh, likewise. Be well.